stand on the shoulders of giants, but leave them behind. Kill your heroes and your influences. In the 80s, sidechain compression on everything wasn't available as it is today. The bass in the 80s wasn't as prevalent or as loud as it is today. First 12 to 15 months, don't go down the rabbit hole of trying to design your own patches. After 15 months or something, or 12, okay, now then you can start looking into sound design.
Welcome to the Musician Odyssey podcast, where we help you navigate past the sea monsters and storms on your music journey so you can reach your goals faster and live the dream. Hi, I'm Reagan Ram, the owner and founder of OrpheusAudioAcademy.com. Today's episode number 4 of the podcast, and I'm speaking with Alonso of Synthwave Dojo, and I'm really excited to share with you the awesome content that he shares in this episode. He has a lot of great content on his YouTube channel, so definitely check that out. I'll have a bunch of other amazing resources in the description below, so be sure to check that out. It's great to have you here, Alonso. I'm really excited for this call to talk about synthwave music. So go ahead and just introduce yourself. What's your history with music, and how did you get into creating synthwave music and starting Synthwave Dojo?
Alrighty, thank you very much, Reagan, for this opportunity to share a little bit about myself and Synthwave Dojo. Well, I started playing music when I was, I think, in my mid-teens. Like every other guy in the mid-90s, I was a fan of grunge, Nirvana, Soundgarden, all of those guys. And actually, I had started being a fan of music early in the 80s as I was a kid, and listened to a lot of Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, Motley Crue. So those are the bands that really inspired me to make music and listen to music. And since those times, I've learned to play several instruments, like the drums. I can sing, play the guitar, a little bit of keyboard. And for over 30 years now, I've been playing in bands, recording, writing, the whole thing. And regarding synthwave, like millions of others, I think it was around 2011 and 12 where, after watching the movie Drive, that I really liked the sound of the music of the soundtrack. And I investigated a little bit more about the artists, who they were. And at that time, I didn't start making music or synthwave overtly. Just I was involved in some other stuff. And I think it wasn't until maybe 2017 or something that I just started making music more in line with synthwave, and I think with a more focused intention on that specific style. And for the past year and a half or so, I started Synthwave Dojo, which is just this channel or online thing where my ultimate goal is to teach people or help aspiring synthwave producers develop their skills, build their experience and body of knowledge, so they can create the synthwave music that's in their heart. And basically, that's what Synthwave Dojo is all about.
That's really cool. Yeah, I wasn't born in the 80s, so you had that you were a little closer to the ground floor of the beginnings of synthwave. So that's pretty cool. So you talk about wanting to help other synthwave artists become a black belt in synthwave. So what does that mean to you? What does that look like?
Okay, so if you have ever watched the Karate Kid or any other movie involved with martial arts, or watched the UFC, you know that the black belt in any martial art is an advanced practitioner who's on their way to becoming a master. And it takes you years and years to go from white belt, where anyone starts when they come into the dojo. And by experience, learning, training, and going through these belt examinations, belt degrees, you build your skills and move up the ranks. So a synthwave black belt is an aspirational goal. For me, it's that producer who has solid and advanced skills in composition, songwriting, arrangement, sound design, mixing, mastering, that they can wield their powers and their techniques and make the synthwave that's in their heart, not necessarily effortlessly, because there's always a fight and a battle when you're making music, but they have the ability to make music at a very advanced level without any obvious mistakes or deficiencies. Someone who can say today, I want to write some music, and they can make it happen, and within a couple of days finish whatever track they're working on, and it sounds professional grade. So that to me is a black belt synthwave producer in a nutshell.
That's really cool. I also like that you mentioned it's a battle every time you create music, and it's never easy. And you don't want it to be easy either, because there's this concept known as flow state,
Hmm.
where when you enter flow state, it's kind of this mental state of relaxed high activity where you're at your best. You don't even notice time flying by, and that's when you produce your best creative work. But you only enter flow state when something is certainly easy enough that it's not tripping you up. It's not You're not getting slowed down with what you're doing, but it's
Hmm.
also hard enough that you're not getting bored. It's challenging enough that you're not getting bored. So you always want to have that challenge going on. So that's pretty cool, how you describe that. So you mentioned it's a journey getting to that black belt. It requires training. Picturing there's some good some synthwave martial arts music going on in the background now. But surely there's like what are some of like steps someone can take to get to becoming a black belt faster, right? So if there's all these different steps, what are some of the larger ones you can take? In other words, like um taking the 80-20 principle into effect here, which is it's studies and observations of nature have shown that
Hmm.
like 20% of your efforts will produce 80% of your results. So what are those maybe 20% of things, or like secrets, for lack of a better term, that someone can
Hmm.
do to get 80% of the way closer to becoming a synthwave black belt?
Hmm. For me, to be honest, I despise thinking about secrets, shortcuts, the hacks, and the tricks, because if you want to do anything worthwhile in life, think of becoming a great painter, great actor, or great movie director. What's the shortcut? Ask someone who's a master at their craft how to get there quicker or quickly. Your like the subtext is, how can I get there without effort? How can I get there without paying my dues? And the answer is that you can't, right? Imagine all the work that it takes to become a real black belt. If you just got into the dojo today and you want to become a black belt next week, they're going to literally kick you out of the dojo because you can't really shortcut success, and you can't really shortcut solid understanding and the fundamentals of anything, right? Let alone a craft like music production, where there are like so many things that you have to understand and gain your skills in, and build your skills in. Because we could say that music production is just one thing. Okay, I want to make synthwave. It seems to be like one skill or one ability. But when you start peeling back the onion, the layers are so many and so deep, like composition, arrangement, sound design, mixing, mastering. Those are like the top six. But you take any one of those: composition, there's chord progressions, there's melody, there's a bunch of other stuff, right? And we can go down the rabbit hole for hours and hours. So just to kind of answer your question, for me, definitely it starts with the fundamentals. Learning music theory. Learning music theory in and of its own is not going to make you a better producer. You really have to work to understand how to create effective chord progressions, how to create melodies, then how to manage the energy in an arrangement from beginning to end. Um, you have to learn sound design, you have to learn mixing and mastering. And I would say start at the beginning and take it little by little, and don't expect to make huge jumps in ability from one week to the next. First, okay, so if I could maybe make this more tangible, you have to learn how to make a chord progression. Without that, you can't make any kind of music. Okay, then find out a little bit about making chord progressions, putting chord progressions together. What chord progressions are used in synthwave? So you start there. Then understand what are some of the, let's say, what are the popular elements or parts or voices used in the synthwave arrangement. So you have bass, drums, maybe a chord pad or an arpeggio, and some kind of lead or melodic element. Then you have to find out how to create a kind of a melody to get things going. So you learn a little bit about those things, and you start trying to create a your main stack, which is that 8-bar loop that everyone uses to start an arrangement or to further develop a track. And then little by little, you gain just a little bit of experience and make progress until you get to being able to make a full track. However, I don't recommend attempting to go from zero production skills to a full track within a week or within a month, because again, there's so many steps that you need to go through, so many little skills and abilities that you have to wrap your mind around and figure it out how to put together. That if you started last week and wanted to make a track in 2 weeks, you're going to be super frustrated and you're not going to be able to make it. It's kind of like try to if you take good pictures, but in a week from now you want to direct or create a full featured film, full length film. It's not going to happen. You need like so many things you need to learn before you get to that point. So in the end, I don't know if I was able to answer the question, but for me, really there are no shortcuts. There's no way to speed up substantially the process. Learn the fundamentals: composition, arrangement, mixing, mastering, sound design, and in time you'll see that all those things will come together if you keep at it, and if you keep putting in the effort and pushing through the pain and the frustration. You'll get there eventually.
That's really good. So there's no secrets, but really getting back to the fundamentals is what you want to focus on, and then build from there. So do you ever find like there's like producers getting like lost in the weeds at all? Is there like things maybe they're wasting their time on trying to master that's maybe not as important as those fundamentals or other elements of production?
Well, I think there are a few key stages in the in the career or in the path of a producer. So the first stage is being able to come up with a solid main stack or 8-bar loop. So that should be like the first milestone. There's a little bit of composition, a little bit of arrangement, sound design involved, and some other stuff, like a little bit of mixing just to getting an 8-bar loop to sound good. And once you're able to pull that off by selecting the right patches, the right number of voices or parts, right? So typically a bass line, drums, maybe a pad, an arp, maybe a chord playing a simple kind of groove or something, and a melodic element. Once you have that together and it sounds decent and within the context of synthwave, then the next step is, okay, how can I turn this not into a full-length track, right? Again, let's not jump from taking a picture to wanting to direct or shoot a full-length film. The next step would be, let's try a 40-bar arrangement, which is like 8 bars of intro, 8 bars of outro, 8 bars of groove, 8 bars of dropping your main melodic element, then 8 bars of a secondary element. Then let's get our feet wet in understanding how we can create a 40-bar arrangement. Cool. Once you've done 10 to 15 of those, you develop a little bit more of your mixing skills of adding delay, reverb, maybe a little bit of EQ and compression, and you're able to create an effective 40-bar arrangement or mini track. Then make progress and move on to an 80-bar arrangement, which, as you're doubling the time, you are more than doubling the problems and the issues that you'll face. And then again, you learn to battle an 80-bar arrangement, and once you can solidly do that, make 10 or 15 or 20, then you can graduate to a full-length arrangement. It's the same as if you wanted to run a marathon, you don't go from couch potato or not running at all to marathon in 6 months, maybe not even within a year. You first have to develop your skills, your endurance, your body, your mind, your heart. There are many things involved, and you start running distances, and every week just a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer, until you get to a point where you're like 3/4 into the full distance of a marathon. That's when you can run a marathon. But you can't go from 1 mile to 26 miles easily. You have to develop your skills gradually and be able to hit certain milestones. And I think that a lot of producers, again, they try to go from writing a decent main stack and attempting to go for a full length track, and they get lost in the middle. Again, they try to run the marathon and they die at mile 15. They didn't even get to the 30 to the 20s, right? And it's that thinking about those milestones where you are in progressively developing your skills, your stamina, your endurance, and your knowledge to be able to just go a little bit further, another mile before you're able to tackle a full length track.
Okay. So with that, so you talked about like production and arrangement and so forth. So how does that apply to synthwave, or how does synthwave differ than creating other types of music? Like what goes into creating a good synthwave arrangement or writing a good synthwave song?
That's a great question. 80% is the same as creating an effective or great sounding track in techno, house, French house, or whatever else, whatever other style you can fit in. There's you need solid skills, arrangement, composition, sound design, right? And you also need to understand the conventions and the expectations of the genre, right? What are the conventions and expectations of synthwave? There are various camps. There's the camp that believes, or that, yeah, that thinks that synthwave is about sounding like the 80s
Hmm.
overtly. There's another camp that says it's not about sounding like the 80s. Maybe it's a little bit about the nostalgia of thinking about the 80s, but the music has more of a modern, contemporary feel, right? Maybe not necessarily using drum samples from the 80s and a lot of reverb, but somehow it still has a little bit of that flavor, right? So understanding the conventions. And I would say that for starters, using the appropriate drum samples, like the classic drum machine samples, the Lin, the 707, some of the Rolands, like the R8, Elises, and all of those, will get you, that will be a good start. Then using emulation synths like the Arturias, Korgs, and all of those, where you're emulating a Juno, a Jupiter, some of those classic 80s synths, using arpeggios, pads. Some of those tools will certainly get you sounding synthwave and in the general ballpark quicker than if you were to go with, let's say, house or techno samples and start making music with a synth like Massive or Serum, that they have more of a modern feel, right? So all those elements will get you there, or will get you to a good start. It's the same as, let's say we wanted to put a blues band together or start creating writing blues. What are the conventions of blues? Well, the 12-bar blues, it's major, minor, then the pentatonic scale, the blues scale. So it's just understanding those and trying things out until you're able to effectively create that main stack, or whatever short piece of music that sounds within the context of the genre. And then you get into the question of, okay, the music that I'm making is fitting the genre. That's cool, but where do I go from here? Because if you sound like a Time Cop 1983 clone, that's not going to get you anywhere, because you can't out Time Cop 1983
Mm,
at being Time Cop 1983. The same
right.
with the Midnight, the same with FM 84, or any of the other synthwave heroes out there. Certainly, you have to build your skills to a professional black belt level where you could replicate the music of those guys, really understand what they're doing, and be able to create music that anyone can listen to and say, this is not amateur, this is not a hobbyist, this person is serious, right? But then that's the start of the journey. Again, you can't be the clone of someone else. When you get to that level, you have to really dig deep and start on the path of, okay, so what is the thing that I'm bringing to the table? Because Time Cop has his stuff, the Midnight has their stuff. What am I bringing, right? If I'm
Right.
just making music like anyone else, it's not going to go anywhere. Yeah, people will enjoy it, but artistically, musically, I think you're not contributing much. So that's where the real work begins, because anyone can learn how to mix, master, use a compressor, how to create an effective chord progression and a pseudo melodic element like most people out there do, and put something together that's in the general ballpark of synthwave, like a lot of YouTubers do, where they do these 7 minute synthwave videos or productions, right? And
Yeah.
it really doesn't take a lot of skill to, when you're a good producer, you can produce in a lot of styles, but they're not really contributing anything to the genre. They're not pushing the envelope, and that's the real work that begins once you get your skills at those levels. And the thing is that there's no blueprint for that process or for that journey. Certainly, a lot of places can teach you all the fundamentals, like we've been talking about, but to be able to bring something to the table and develop your own style, there's no blueprint for that. No one can really teach you. Only years of trial and error and really digging deep and experimenting with stuff. Let me take my music to this direction. Did I like it? Did anyone connect with it? Did I enjoy it? No, maybe let me take it to this other direction, experiment. Then you take all those experiences that were, let's say, to at the fringes of mainstream synthwave, then you bring them together and do something more mainstream, but with some of those elements. And maybe in there, that's where you'll find your thing and your own flavor and sound. But it has to be certainly with intention, right? And you have to really dig deep and go into uncharted territories to find that.
Yeah, that's really good because I love synthwave. Right, we're all huge synthwave fans here, but right, if I had one critique, I would say that sometimes a lot of the music can sound a little similar, a little too similar.
Mhm.
So yeah, so how do you go about creating a song that still sounds synthwavy, has those elements that you talked about, but still is unique, like you talked about? How do you? What are some guidelines maybe you'd give someone on how they can go
Mhm.
about finding their unique twist? What are some like you mentioned experimenting? What are some experiments someone can run? Is it just maybe
Mhm.
looking to other genres and pulling in elements from other genres, or do you have any guidance in that area?
I think part of it is maybe bringing in influence from some other genres. Another part of it is experimenting with the way that you're putting together certain elements. So let me see if I can discuss some of that. I just finished the first track of an EP that I'm working on, and it is I'm trying to combine synthwave and reggae, kind of like the reggae that the Police did back in the '80s, which is kind of pop rock
Mm,
reggae. So I'm going for this very spacey reverb and open feel. Think of Walking on the Moon with with classic drum machine samples and with these emulation synth, and kind of going for that vibe, right? So I just ended or finished the first track. I went and learned about creating bass lines for reggae, the drum sounds, the drum patterns. I programmed a lot of percussion, so I went on YouTube and looked up conga patterns for reggae or timbale patterns for reggae, and this was a very interesting experience. Ultimately, definitely, it's not synthwave for everyone and anyone. It has a very specific flavor. I think it does fit the mold. Um, I would say loosely of it being synthwave, but in any case, I learned a lot just by going out of my comfort zone, trying something different, learning new skills. Then when I bring all that back in and do something more mainstream, I'm sure some of that will percolate or will come through in the music. So it's making experiments like that. Or for example, a few months ago, I made a 3-track EP where the EP is called 118 AM. And the gist of that EP is that the 3 tracks are in the tempo of 118 BPM, and they're all in A minor. So by creating that limitation or that self-imposed restriction of all the 3 tracks being at 118 BPM and in A minor, I had to really think about how I could make the tracks sound different one from the other, still within a general context. In that experiment, I also found it super useful and satisfying because I had to really work hard to do something new, at least for me. And again, trying out stuff like that, which may not always pan out, but again, going out of your comfort zone, trying other things, then bringing them back more into the mainstream. That's one general idea. The other is being very choiceful and intentional about the things that you do. For example, when you make a track, think about the drums, like the drum patterns. If you make enough tracks, or if you think about it, um, every time that you make a track, how do you program the drums? Do you always do them the same? What is the philosophy or the intention that you're bringing to your drums? For example, do you like to keep your drums simple? Do you like a lot of fills or bring in certain complexity? Do you like something super simple? Right. So in time, if you make conscious choices about the way that you create your drum parts, as you make more music, as you build your body of work, someone will be able to tell, okay, I know this is an Alonso track because his drum parts are typically super simple, but at certain times they do this or do that, right? Or they're typically very tasteful and they do feel like a live drummer as opposed to a programmed drum machine. Okay, so that's one way. Or for example, um, thinking about melodies, it's very common or in synthwave, what I to come into or to come into contact with what I call pseudo melodies, which aren't really melodies, more melodic elements, where people just take an arpeggio and play just a couple of notes, and those aren't really melodies that go anywhere, that take you on a journey from beginning to end, right? So that's very hard to find in synthwave because people, they don't make the effort of learning how to properly write a melody. But in any case, if on your tracks you make the effort to make every melodic element and every melody super solid, telling a story, or really going beyond just taking the core tones and creating something that sounds like a pseudo arpeggio, in time, if you do that many times, come up with great riffs and with great melodies, people would notice and they would say, oh, if there's a melody that I feel is taking me somewhere that really speaks, that has to be an Alonso song, because I know his music, and I know how he really likes to craft melodies that speak to me, that make me feel something. Maybe the same with some other production element. Maybe let's say like reverb or lack of reverb. Let's say I really like my arrangements to be super drenched and washed in reverb, but in a way that works. So every time you hear a track that has that super reverbed sound, that's, I don't know, whatever, you immediately say, okay, that it has to be this guy's track versus another, right? And it's those choices that we make every time that we produce a track over and over, that will say that will point to us. It's the same as you think of an Adele song, right? What makes an Adele song an Adele song? Well, if you listen to a chorus, you say, oh, definitely that's Adele. And if it were something else, then it would be a different band or a different artist. But then it's the making the same choices uh, with consciousness and intention over and over in your songwriting, in your production, that ultimately, as you build your body of work, those tiny details, some of those details are very big, some of them are small. The choices, maybe you only like to use one synth in your entire track, where you're using different patches, of course, for the bass and the lead or whatever, but you only use Juno and, let's say, Lynn. If all your tracks are Juno Lynn, that's something very particular that people could immediately recognize, right? And it's making those weird decisions that you stick to them. Um, think about Van Gogh, right? The way that he painted, how he used to paint. You see a painting and immediately you recognize Van Gogh versus some other guy. And it's the same, trying to look for those decisions, conscious choices, and that you make time and time again, that ultimately will start to build or create your style and your flavor.
Okay. So I guess to summarize, so would you say, so it's basically identify those key elements that you really love, that really you like, and that becomes kind of the core of your sound, and then one at a time identify different elements that you maybe want to experiment with.
Right, certainly. And it's definitely a path, a journey. And some of these choices, you don't make them consciously, and you can't make all of these choices while producing your first track, maybe not your 10th, right? It's when you're on the journey, when you create many tracks, one after the other with certain consistency, you start making those decisions like, oh, this last track, I really liked how the drums came out. So let me try that on my next track, right? Or really, I feel like the melody that I did on this other track sounded pretty cool. Let me try something, a similar approach to this track. So it's all done in movement, in motion, right? Like you can't steer a parked car. These things in training and in working your butt off to make music. It's not something that you sit down and figure out the destination before you get there. It's like, imagine going from the East Coast to the West Coast in the US, and wanting to just follow a very just the same path with all the traffic lights being green. That's not going to happen, right? There are going to be detours and a lot of stuff that happens along the way, and the real growth and the challenges and all these decisions that make up your style, you find them while you're in motion. struggling in the trenches or battling it out, right, with the production process.
That's really cool. So, with that in mind, or real quick, I will just say, like, I think a band that did this really well, or like one of the bigger synthwave bands, is the Midnight with their album Monsters. I think that was a very different sounding album. They had like trap style drums, is a little bit
Mhm.
more pop. I felt like, which at first I didn't like it as much. I'm like, oh, this isn't really the same old Midnight I'm used to. But then the more I listen to it, now it's like one of my favorite albums. I think it's really cool. They have some of those like more modern like vocal pitch effects and vocal chop kind of stuff that you don't typically hear in synthwave. So it's really
Mhm.
creates a really unique sound and really stands out to me. I think it's really a cool album. Um, so now if we get maybe getting more into like the production side of things, so
Mhm.
we know kind of the big things for making synthwave, right? You gotta have like lots of reverb, gated reverb on the snare, right? You're using those drum samples you talked about, like vintage synth sounds. Is there anything, right, I'm missing that maybe stems from the 80s production techniques that have been
Mhm.
lost or aren't talked about as much? What are some things that maybe we don't know that we don't know as synthwave music producers that'd be really cool to add to create that more authentic 80s sound, or just something different because it's not been used in a while?
Mhm. Okay. So for me, if you want to go for a more 80s authentic sound, there's a couple of things that you can do in contrast a contemporary modern sound. One of them, the use of sidechain. In the 80s, sidechain compression on everything wasn't available as it is today. So forget about sidechain compression. Don't compress your bass, don't compress your pads, don't sidechain compress anything. Forget about it. And find ways of creating the arrangement and giving the arrangement excitement via other tools or via other techniques. So that's one thing. The other thing, if you listen to a lot of like the 80s pop from back in the day, like from Madonna to Prince, Michael Jackson, Belinda Carlisle, and even the synth pop acts from the 80s, the level of the bass and the kick were very different than how we're used to setting them today. The bass in the 80s wasn't as prevalent or as loud as it is today. In most of those tracks, Madonna, Prince, you name it, whatever, the bass was mostly adequate or weak, right? So it's not like this super huge bass. Um, so that's one thing. If you want to create music that sounds kind of like the 80s, your bass cannot be the lead instrument or super present. The same with the kick. Of course, mileage varies, but the kick for in most of those productions wasn't the predominant sound, not even the loudest sound in the drum kit. Typically, the snare would always be louder than the kick, and again, the kick would sometimes be more felt than heard, and it wasn't as big and huge as techno house and synth pop that we hear on Spotify or whatever else.
Right.
So that mixing technique was is different.
Yeah, that
The
kind of makes me
bass.
think of the song Drive by the Cars. I can't remember how loud the kick is, but I just remember that snare is huge.
You can't almost hear it. And also, have you listened to the song by, I'm just forgetting his name, the guy from the Eagles, drummer Don Henley, "The Boys of Summer"? Go
Mm.
listen to that track now, and you'll hear how weak the drums are. Like the loudest element is the tambourine, the kick and the snare. They sound Lin to me or some other classic drum machine,
Use more
but they're
cowbell.
super weak, like super low in the mix. Like the kick and the snare don't drive anything. The guitars are super loud, right? So it's like this mix where you have loud guitars, you have the vocals just a little bit beneath and sometimes behind, and the drums are almost non-existent. So for me, like looking at it on paper, it sounds like a terrible mix. And when I listen to it intently and focus on the elements, to me, it's like if I were to mix that today, the balance of the drums for me would have been higher with more punch and more energy. This is a really bad mix, right? Just thinking about it. But then that song is one of the biggest songs that Don Henley ever had. I will never have a song that's going to be as popular as that one. So what's the deal with that, right? So how do we swallow that pill? Because ultimately, a lot of the aspects that we as producers, songwriters, mixers, whatever, like to really think about and lose sleep over ultimately they don't matter, right? What matters is that the track or the song paint a picture, communicate an emotion, and take the listener on a ride. And that doesn't matter unless there are severe flaws in the arrangement, composition, and mixing process. A lot of quirky decisions or decisions that could have been done better at some other time, ultimately they don't matter, because when you listen to that track, Voice of Summer, it takes you somewhere, like you feel this energy, like this melancholy vibe, like, yeah, you want the girl and you're trying to fight for her. Um, and you forget about all those technical aspects that I mentioned, and all of that goes into the background, and it doesn't matter anymore. The same as, have you watched the movie Lost in Translation with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson?
No.
Well, there's this very famous band in the 80s, the Jesus and the Mary Chain, and they have a track, one of their most known tracks. It's called something like Honey. I just forgot the name. And if you go listen to that on Spotify, YouTube, or whatever, like a lot of tracks, alternative rock or pop tracks from the 80s and 90s, I would say the mix is terrible, super harsh. The guitars, they sound like they were plugged directly into the mixing desk, and so washed in reverb. But like, really, if you were to mix that today, you would say, yeah, this really needs a complete remix. But again, the experience of listening to that track, the emotion that comes through it takes you to a certain place that it goes beyond the technical aspects, right? So I don't remember anymore what the question was, but certainly that's the thing that we need to go for as producers and songwriters is, yeah, we need to get our chops to a certain level, but then it's about what are we trying to communicate and how we can do that, right? Go beyond the technical stuff and how we can connect to how we can make the listener connect with the experience that we're trying to present.
All right. Yeah. So when we get down to it, really the songwriting and the arrangement, that's like 80% of what makes a great song. And then the production side of things is just kind of 20%. So if it's a really great song, you don't really notice the production, or at least that casual listener doesn't. They just know it sounds good. It's a good song.
Mhm.
So yeah, you don't want your production, I guess, to be distracting, but you also want to enhance the actual arrangement, the songwriting elements that are there.
Mhm.
So with that, like you mentioned, like there's the two camps. So do you think we should be trying to go back and recreate that really authentic 80s sound, or do we acknowledge that production has advanced, and should we more so embrace the more modern production, or does it just depend on the song and the
Mhm.
artist?
I think every synthwave artist should make that choice on their own and come to terms with that. And maybe it's not necessarily like a black or white kind of decision where you always do this or always do that. In my music, I tend to favor more the 80s style production. Um, and another thing that I forget to mention when we were talking about age production, for example, transitional effects, filter sweeps, and all that kind of thing that you can easily do in automation in a DAW that are prevalent and part of the bread and butter toolkit of every producer. All that didn't exist back in the 80s. So again, if you want to make music that's a little bit more 80s, sounds more like the 80s, forget about the transitional effects, the reverse sweeps, all of that, because that didn't exist. So find other ways like drum fills, other melodic lines where the instruments stop and do something, accents. That's the way that they did it back then. But in any case, going back to your question, I think it's a matter of maybe not making a choice of always doing this or always doing that. I tend to favor more a little bit of the 80s style production um, in certain tracks, but then on another, I would go a little bit more towards the contemporary sound. I don't like the 100% contemporary sound, because to me then it sounds like a lot like synth pop or EDM with a little bit of a nostalgic or I would say throwback flavor. So I tend to be kind of in the middle, skewed a little bit towards the 80s by intention. That's the way that I like to do it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like there's a plugin I really like by UJam called Vice, and it's like a synthwave drum plugin, and it has a slider on there. You can slide it up to be 2080 or 1980, so you can kind of have the more modern or the more vintage. So with that in mind, you've just been shipwrecked. You're on a desert island. Good news is there's palm trees. The sun has been transformed. It's now the synthwave sun. You got this sunset going on. There's a DeLorean next to you, strangely.
Mhm.
You're on the desert island. You just have your DAW and your stock plugins, and you can pick 3 desert island plugins to take with you, maybe like premium plugins. What are those plugins you take with you to create synthwave music?
Synths or processors?
Well, I guess that's 2 different categories. We'll start with synths, and then we'll do processors.
Okay, synths. I would take a Juno emulation, an OBX, and a Prophet 5 emulation. Those would be my 3. And I would take the Arturia. I think those are, if not the best, then right up there with the best, those 3.
Is there like a favorite company that creates those? Because I use Syntronic, which has emulations of all those. Is there? I know Arturia has those as well. Is there a specific like brand or company that you like?
I really like Arturia. I know that Yuhi does the Repro, which is the Prophet 5. Tal does Tal Uno LX, which is the Juno. So I would say I would just go with Arturia. I like their plugins, like their sound and the layout, and across different plugins, you have the same way of creating playlists, of favoriting patches, this and that. So I just like that consistency. So I guess those would be they are as good or the best out there. And in terms of processors, let's see, I would take an 1176 compressor. I would take probably the Fab Filter EQ3 or Pro Q3, whatever it's called. And I would take a good reverb with me.
What's your favorite reverb?
I don't know. I like the there's this company that does a plugin called 80s Spaces, but I don't remember exactly who makes it. And I would take that one. I think it's very good. It has gated reverb and some other functionality. Those would be the 3 processors that I take with me to the desert island.
All right. And then in your regular, workflow, do you use many free plugins, or is there any great free plugins for Synthwave that you'd recommend?
I don't use free plugins much. I use them mostly for some of the sound design tutorials that I do. But certainly some of the free ones that come to mind that are very good, the Great or GR8 by Future Tone. It's a Jupiter 8 emulation. To me, it sounds very good. The Synth 1, which the interface I don't like very much, but I think the capabilities and the sound are very good. Of course, the OBXD, that's also one of the top used Synthwave plugins. PG8X, also that one's very good. And I think with those 4, and even the Tal free one, what's it called? The Uno
Noisemaker?
62, no, the Uno 62 L62, like the free version of their Tal Uno LX. It's kind of old, but I think it has a very cool sound.
I didn't know if that. Yeah, I think that's like not supported on my computer, so otherwise I would have that. But
okay,
I didn't know they still had that. Okay,
those 4 ones that I mentioned, I think they're really good. And with those, honestly, you could make a lot of music without purchasing any of the paid plugins, and you wouldn't feel like you're lacking anything. They sound very, very good and have very strong capabilities.
Cool. And where do you fall on the sound design versus like presets debate? Is it worthwhile to really use these tools to really create your own sounds? Or since we're kind of working in a genre where there's the classic sounds that we know work, is it better just to find those presets and focus your time on the actual songwriting, the arrangement, and the production? For me,
the answer to that question depends on the stage you're in. For example, if you're a white belt producer, a beginner, for the first 12 to 15 months, just get yourself a good sound bank or sound pack or whatever synthwave sounds for whatever synths you have, and use them so you can get your ears trained to certain kinds of sounds. And in parallel, learn just a little bit of synthesis and sound design so you can tweak those patches a little bit. But initially, for those first 12 to 15 months, don't go down the rabbit hole of trying to design your own patches, right? Just use patches, tweak them a little bit. Because even Timecop did that for the first, 5 or 8 years of his career. I don't think he does that anymore. But in any case, so and instead focus your time on composition, on mixing, on arranging, on coming up with ideas and creating music that sounds good. Then after 15 months or something, or 12, give or take, once you have you got your bearings and you have solid skills on all that I mentioned, okay, now then you can start looking into sound design, because by that time you'll most likely have faced the situation where there's a specific sound that comes to mind and I just can't find it in my patches. Maybe I have it, maybe I don't, and I'm just spending like 30 minutes, 40 minutes trying to find something, right? And when you get to that point, that's where maybe your ears are trained and ready to start going into sound design. So today, I don't think I use almost any presets. Most of them, for my tracks, I make them my own, unless I'm going
Wow.
with a marimba sound from the Core M1 or something, right? You can't synthesize a marimba sound. But right now, to me, it's super easy. And it's very clear to me because of all the tutorials that I've made about basses, pads, and that. Like in 3 minutes, I can create almost any kind of bread and butter patch that I want. So for me, it takes more time to go into a library and find patches that I like. And most of the times, I go, okay, synthwave basses. And sorry, but even the Time Cop, Tau UNOLX library, I try to go for a bass, and most of them I don't like. So I spend a lot of time going through that, and that's what happens to me, right? I go, okay, a pad, and I go to someone's library, and it's a pad with a bunch of bull BS that it's like I can't fit this into any kind of track. I wasted 5 minutes just going there, so I just design my own patches very quickly. But you need to get to that point, and again, it's not in your initial stages. Leave that for year and a half, after 2 years in. So once you have your ears developed and have had time or have the bandwidth to look into sound design, study and train, because that's a rabbit hole in and of itself. And that
Yeah.
is setting aside FM synthesis, right? Because that,
Oh yeah.
for me, if I'm going to use anything FM related at the moment, it's strictly a preset machine, like the Aha bass or the other Take My Breath Away bass and some other sounds that I know. I just use it as a preset machine, but forget about trying to come up with cooking up something from scratch. That's a whole another ballpark, man. You know, it's also
Yeah.
another different rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's another dimension. So how did
Yeah.
you learn sound design? How did you get good at doing sound design? Did you take courses? Are you just a savant and you can hear stuff and you're like, oh, I just need to turn the filter like this and route
To be
this
honest,
there?
this is the trick, or the best way that I can teach anyone sound design. Go and watch a couple of videos where someone clearly and explains well what's an oscillator, what's an envelope, the ADSR, what's an LFO, and what are the filters and some of the filter types, and what's the difference between a square wave and a pulse wave and all that. But up to that point, it's more of a theoretic knowledge, and you say, okay, there's different waves for different things. I have the envelopes, I control this and that and that. Okay, cool. But then what I found to be the most effective is get yourself in this case, a synthwave patch bank or sound bank or whatever. Okay, then use that synth, favorite certain patches that you like, and do this. Take a screenshot of a bass patch, okay, and save that on your desktop or wherever electronic document, and open it up. Then go to that same synth and initialize the default patch. So you start from scratch. Then you go on your computer and you do the control tab or command tab shortcut on Windows or Mac, like to go from one window to the next quickly, right? Without having to use your mouse. And then you take a look at the screenshot of that bass patch and start with the oscillators, then go to the envelopes, then filters, LFOs, and effects. Okay, then look at the oscillators of the patch. Okay, I see that it's a sawtooth wave with a sub oscillator. Let me do that on my patch. What else on the oscillator section? Okay, cool. Let me go to the envelope section. Blah, blah, blah. Let me replicate that. Let me then go to the filters. Okay, low pass filter. Blah blah blah. Replicate it here, and you replicate that patch, and it will take you maybe 5 to 10 minutes to do it. And once you do that for the first time, okay, take a look at the choices that you made. Okay, then go back to the default patch and replicate it once more, looking at the screenshot, and do that 3 or 4 times until it's like you almost know what moves you're going to make on the synth. And once you do that, right, 4 or 5 times, then try to replicate it from memory and really feel like those different moves that you make, what effect they have. So that's for, let's say, one kind of patch on one synth. Then on that same synth, do the same thing with a pad patch. take the screenshot, do the same thing, and every day spend 10 or 15 minutes doing that, watching the screenshot and recreating patches, and then like in the morning or in the afternoon, try to recreate a patch from the day after without looking at the screenshot, right? And you'll see that in time, you'll get under your fingers the different choices that you make. So what happens if I take the attack just a little bit halfway on this synth, because the parameters on all synths are different, where the parameters are located are different, how they behave are different. So it's different programming a patch on Tau Uno versus on Arturia's Juno emulation versus on Massive. If you get your attack, or let's say the filter cutoff halfway, it sounds different on all of those, right? Like the steepness of the curve, even though they all saying they are 24 dBs per octave, you do feel that on certain synths, you bring it down a little bit and it takes a lot of the high end away. In any case, you do these practices like 5 to 10 or 15 minutes a day, copying patches that you like, then recreating them from memory, and then experimenting. Okay, I have this bass sound. What happens if I increase the resonance just a little bit too much? Okay, this is what happens. Cool, I make a mental memory of that. Then what happens if this patch that I really know, I know really well how to create? What happens if I increase the release in the envelope, or if I increase the resonance or something, right? Or make the cutoff and the modulation amount of the filter, give it a little bit more of a distance, or make them close together. And in time, if you practice recreating patches, then taking those patches to extreme values, what happens if I push this to the extreme? It's like you develop muscle memory and an understanding of a particular synth. And the sad thing is you have to do this almost in any synth because they're different, right? But again, learn to create a group of bread and butter patches, like bass, pad, some kind of ARP, some kind of lead, and then try to recreate those on different synths. And again, in time, it's like, like going to the dojo and practicing your kicks and your punches and all of that. In time, it just becomes second nature. And the good thing is that you're creating patches that you already like, that sound synthwave, as opposed to go and recreate a patch for, I don't know, for techno house or new disco. Recreate synthwave patches, and again, in time, you learn to create your own patches with all those moves that you're making and that sound within the scope of synthwave. And also, you will learn, for example, if whatever a patch, say a bass patch, sounds too short, like too stabby for me, maybe I want my patch to have a little bit more of a sound connecting the notes. Is that the release or is that the sustain? Okay, then my sound is going to have a little bit more of sustain or release to get there. That's where you start making all those choices, which we talked about. In the end, it's going to form part of your style.
That's really awesome. So start off, learn the fundamentals of synthesizers, the oscillators, the filters, so on, LFOs. Then start recreating patches, and then from there you start tweaking things and see, what does this actually do? What if I change the attack? What if I change the waveform? And so you actually learn things and you start making your own patches. So that's really, really interesting. So good news. Go ahead.
And sorry to interrupt, but watching a video on the fundamentals of synthesis, like what are the components, that's a 10, 15, or 20-minute video at the most. But then the rest of it is just getting hands-on experience. Because, for example, if I were to tell you, okay, if you have a bass patch, okay, maybe your attack has to be immediate, and the release, well, you could try a medium release or kind of a fastish release, but then you have to be careful that the cutoff cannot be too low, but then if it's too low, then you have to give it a little bit more of a filter modulation amount. And all those kinds of, that kind of information, it's worthless to you until you're experimenting on your synth, right? And you've figured some of those things out when the rubber meets the road. It's kind of like learning how to swim by watching a video or reading a book. It's not going to happen, right? The fundamentals are very easy, but the other part is just getting hands-on experience and recreating sounds that already work and that have a professional sound within the context of the music that you're going for.
Excellent. And I'm assuming you would recommend that when you're learning sound design, that should be separate from writing a song, right? If you're in the middle of writing a song, you shouldn't get lost in the weeds and trying to sound design. Those should be two separate processes.
Yeah, there's people who, when they're producing something, they could stop for an hour just to get the best bass patch or whatever sound, and they will stop their flow just to get that. For me, I rather do kind of like creative creation and think of a lot of components as a placeholder or temporary. I'll get back to them maybe in time. Something that was bothering me, I just come to love it and I don't change it anymore. But when I'm in the flow of creating, I try to consider certain things as placeholders. So let me just find a patch that sounds good enough. Cool. Let me just go do something else, because I know that the bass patch is not going to make or break my track, unless I'm trying to use a bass sound from techno or whatever, right? And I'll just leave it for later. Then I'll have like an editing session where I may tweak things and, okay, let me think about this patch. Is this patch working? Yes or no? But I try not to, when I'm in the flow, in the creative flow, try not to stop it by going down the rabbit hole of trying to get something perfect, because perfect is always the enemy of creativity, right? Leave that for later, if at all.
Right. So good news, you chose the right plugins on your desert island and you've become world famous, and now people flock to your dojo that you've built on this desert island, and they come all across the world for your sage advice and wisdom. What's the number one piece of advice you'd give to a beginner to intermediate producer, someone who's looking to create synthwave music?
That's a very good question. If you're a beginner, like you haven't created your first track yet, learn the fundamentals: composition, arrangement, and baby steps. Focus on creating that main stack or 8-bar loop that sounds within the genre. That will be it. Just focus a little bit day by day until you get to that point. To an intermediate producer, I would say continue building your formal music theory skills. And at that time, when you're intermediate, maybe you've done or produced 5 to 10 tracks, get to 25 to 30 tracks, okay? And an advanced synthwave producer, I would say focus on the flavor, your style, your voice, which you're bringing to the synthwave table. Forget about your heroes, stand on the shoulders of giants, but leave them behind. Kill your heroes and your influences. Focus on what makes your music yours and finding that out if you don't know that already. So those are the 3 different advice that I would give to 3 different producers in their career.
Excellent. So thank you so much for coming on. This has been really helpful. Speaking of helpful things, I know you have a free drum sample pack. Is that correct?
Yeah, the 80s drum machines, which is, I'm happy to say that I almost always use those drum machines in my productions. I really love those samples. And if anyone wants to get a copy of those, you can go to my website, which is synthwavedojo.com/downloads. You can get a bunch of stuff that I have there for free. You don't need to sign up or provide your email or anything. You can get those drum machine samples as well as some other very cool tools in there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. This has been awesome. If you have any comments or questions or anything, go ahead and leave those in the comments below. And be sure to check out Synthwave Dojo on YouTube for more awesome help and tips on creating synthwave music. Thanks again, Alonso. It's been awesome. Keep having fun on your synthwave desert island there.
Will do. And thank you very much, Reagan, for this opportunity. I hope this is the first of many. And I hope that the people in your channel or in your world will found this useful in a way. And if there are any questions or comments, I would be glad to chime in and answer them. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Have a great rest of your day.
Hey, if you found this podcast valuable and you're watching on YouTube, be sure to hit the like button and click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes we release. And if you're listening on a podcasting platform, then it'd be a huge help if you could go ahead and leave a 5-star review, as this helps other independent music artists find this content in the future. And if you're hungry for more content that can help speed you past those sea monsters and storms on your music journey so you can reach your goals and live the dream, then be sure to click the video playing on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube, as that will take you to a previous episode of this podcast that is chock full of value. With that, have an awesome day, keep creating, and I'll see you in the next episode.